Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for being here. We are shifting gears right now. We are turning to another special subject area as opposed to healthcare, as opposed to privilege, as opposed to national security. This is about financial firms, where cybersecurity is obviously of the utmost importance, given that all of our retirement, our savings, and everything are tied into these companies. And we have a terrific panel. Let's start off with a piece of nostalgia for these introductions. Let me whistle something. You ready? Daron Hartvigsen. Tell me what I'm whistling.
Yeah, it sounds like $6 Million Man.
That's right. That is the theme from the $6 Million Man, which for those of you in our age group, you will remember as a terrific show. And that was about the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Steve Austin, who was the agent. And that agency is where our first speaker, Daron Hartvigsen, has worked. Right now, he's the managing director at Ankura with more than 30 years of experience in IT. He is the Steve Austin of incident response. And what makes him perfect for this panel is not just that he was part of that super elite cadre of cyber experts. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations is a really elite group of cyber investigations. He also organized, trained, equipped, and assessed the Air Force's OSI's elite global cyber investigative workforce. So he really was doing all this for the government for quite a long time in one of the most elite groups. And what also makes him so adept that I like about Daron is he's not just good at about doling out proposals and strategies and doing digital forensic exams and malware reverse engineering. He's also good when he's briefing the client as to what's going on in plain English. Partners, vendors, employees, the board, all of these constituencies need to be briefed. And it's great to have someone with Daron's pedigree doing that. And not everyone can do it, but his sort of meticulous and candid and very, very professional approach really assures everyone that, number one, the crisis is being handled. So thanks, Daron. Thanks for being here. Can't wait to hear your insights.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it much.
Sure. Next up is Luke Dembosky, co-chair of his firm's data strategy and security practice at Debevoise and Plimpton. What makes Luke a cyber expert is not just his extraordinary legal and technical expertise, which led to his selection by Governor Andrew Cuomo to serve as a member of the governor's Cybersecurity Advisory Board. But it's also that Luke has the kind of government experience. I talked about the last panel in terms of length and variety. But Luke has the most unique government experience of anyone. He was DOJ's resident legal advisor at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, something only a half dozen or so DOJ attorneys have ever done. He was also deputy chief for litigation at DOJ's computer crime and intellectual property section, overseeing DOJ's data breach response efforts at Target, Sony, Home Depot, Anthem, OPM, the Office of Professional Management, and many more. And he was also deputy assistant attorney general at DOJ of the National Security Division, focusing on nation state threats. Sooner or later, we will see Luke back on Air Force One, but right now he's in the private sector and we're lucky to have him here. I wish that Luke could tell me about his time in government, but he'd have to kill me. For now, I'm just thrilled he's here. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you, John.
Sure. Next up is my old friend, Elizabeth Gray, whom I've known since my time at the SEC in the 90s, when Liz was in charge of the SEC's microcap enforcement unit. Back then and still today, quarterbacking the SEC's charge against microcap fraud was no easy task because there was so much fraud from the lawyers and the promoters to the registered reps, financial advisors. It was anarchy. And now as co-chair of the Securities Enforcement Practice Group at Willkie Farr, Liz has leveraged the same expertise from those days into a thriving financial advisory practice. What makes Liz so special, and since I'm from the SEC, I know a lot of SEC lawyers, but she's really one of the few who can manage cyber issues and crypto issues without some outside help, two very complex areas of securities regulation that can bring in and really intimidate a lot of securities lawyers, but not Liz. So welcome, Liz. So great to see you again and have you on this panel as moderator.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here.
Excellent. And then last time, this is the second time our next panelist has been with us, and we could not be more grateful. Ali Karshan works as general counsel for Citigroup on all Citigroup-related cybersecurity matters, including compliance and investigations and law enforcement liaison. This means that she has to be up to speed on what the bank's doing in 160 different countries. The number of regulators and the intensity of the scrutiny upon Ali and her team and everything that she does is really unbelievable. But she has to manage that. Data security, data privacy, and other cyber practices at banks like Citigroup are regulated on so many levels, especially state, federal, international. And they're not only regulated because they're a financial entity or many different financial entities, but they're also a complex public corporation and so much more. So that gives even a greater alphabet soup of regulators and watchdogs. She's been with Citigroup since 2004 and has really seen it all. And it's so great to have her on this panel because her perspective is really, she's really one of the few people who can give you that kind of perspective from a company. So welcome, Ali, and so glad you're here.
Thanks, John. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, take it away, Liz. I'll leave you guys and get the next panel all ready. So thanks to everyone and good luck.
Thanks, John, and good afternoon, everybody. We've got a great panel for you, and we would love to make it dynamic. So if you have questions, you want to ask all of these experts, feel free, and I'll put them through as we do the panel. So financial service firms have the same issues in cybersecurity that many other industries have. They face the risk, they face regulation, and they face the enforcement and the examinations. One thing that's a little different for financial services is how many regulators are focused on it. And not, you know, I'm thinking really in the US, John made the really interesting point that with respect to the international community, there are many regulators as well that Ali has to deal with all the time. But in the US, you know, you've got the Securities and Exchange Commission, the CFTC, the OCC, and then you've got state agencies like, as an example, the New York DFS, really focused on financial service firms and trying to understand whether cybersecurity programs are adequate. So just by way of example, the SEC this year issued their top priorities for examinations, and that their examination staff basically says, this is what we care about this year, this is what we're going to look at the financial service firms, and cybersecurity was right at the top of that list. And they sort of they picked 5 key areas that they said, well, we're going to focus on these areas, and we're going to look at whether firms have taken adequate steps to address vendors and service providers, a big issue that we're going to speak about. Number 2, safeguarding customer accounts. 3, addressing malicious email attacks, including ransomware. 4, which we're also going to speak a fair amount about, how they respond to incidents, whether they have an adequate incident response plan in place. And 5, managing operational risk, particularly in light of everybody working off in their own homes through their computer networks. So that's an example. We're going to kick this off with focusing on third parties and vendor management. And sort of touching on that, as you all know, 2020 had a number of very significant third-party hacks that had broad implications for the economy, both for the government and for the private sector. One of them that was very notable was SolarWinds. And it's a software company whose network management software is used throughout the government, throughout the private sector, and it was hacked. And essentially, it's a supply chain hack. And the attack was devastating, particularly because by compromising one vendor, the attackers were basically able to compromise and get access to all the folks, all the vendors that were using SolarWinds. And that was kind of the nature of where we're heading on third-party and vendor risk and hacks. I mean, other ones included the Microsoft Exchange hack and the Excellion attack. So, Ali, I'm going to have you kick this off. As in-house counsel on cybersecurity, how important has the third-party vendor and service provider oversight been to Citibank's cybersecurity program?
Yeah, it's been a very hot topic and frankly, one of the most time-consuming ones that we've had to deal with over the last year and a half, because there's always potential risk when your vendor is impacted, whether it's through some type of traversing or maliciously spreading into your network, or if you have a B2B connection, or if data is lost that is housed at that vendor. So, we really do have an obligation to make sure we're protecting our network. Every company does. And by doing the due diligence that comes with hiring vendors and then supervising while they're with you, that all helps secure everything that you need related to that.
We're getting some feedback. So everyone should probably mute when we're not talking. So Ellie, have you experienced sort of an increased focus on third-party vendor issues by regulators?
Yeah, it's been huge. I mean, every time there has been something in the news, you can rest assured that the regulators are going to reach out and ask us for information on that. So we've seen, tenfold from regulators in most of the countries that we're in asking about how we've responded to that, if we've been impacted. And it's not only our network, but also our third-party networks. So now there is enhanced due diligence on our part to not only understand what's happening to our network, but to those that we connect with as well.
That must be a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it takes quite a lot of time because when you're dealing with any type of incident response, you're dealing with the issue itself. So then when you add in the regulatory piece and the notifications that have to go with that, often the people who need to get you the information to prepare the communications around those notifications are the same people who are working on the incident itself. So you have people wearing multiple hats, and sometimes their attention gets taken away from whatever it is they need to do to contain the situation, assuming you're exposed to it, rather than, putting together a response for a regulator or a third party or whoever it is who's asking about it.
Yeah. I mean, on that point, have you had moments of being disappointed, not getting sort of notified as quickly as you would hope of a hack on a third party?
Yeah, that definitely happens. And I think it's made even harder these days by so much being out on the internet with the name and shame sites. We often learn about breaches before our vendors or third parties have a chance to even let us know about them. So it gets tricky. And so much of it, I think, depends on the contractual terms related to it, because I think as we've all become more savvy to the cyber issues that are taking place, we now know how to articulate what we want for notification. And when you have terms that might say, all right, we will notify you if your data is impacted, that might not be all the notification you want. You might want to know that their network has been compromised. And even if yours specifically hasn't been compromised, you want to be able to prepare to defend against that. And then also there's a big difference between confirmation that your data has been impacted versus suspicion. It's the difference of weeks and weeks. And when you're in the thick of it, you want to make sure, again, that you can prepare properly to defend your network.
So contractual terms matter?
They absolutely do. And I think we're seeing that a lot of our third-party vendors and clients, because we have agreements with our clients, people are pushing back much more now on the contractual terms around information security. It's no longer as easy as just handing them, here are our standard terms. Do you agree to them? Everybody wants something a little bit bespoke. And when you're a large company and a financial institution operating in many different countries with different rules and regulations, it makes it that much more difficult to try to carve out something specific for one third party and be aware of it. And, so we really do try to stick with a master service agreement that then has that continuity throughout, but more and more people are challenging those.
So Daron, in the wake of all these third-party breaches, have clients been coming to you to help identify what's going on? Are you using more sophisticated technology to assist?
Well, it's interesting, especially the third-party risks that 2020 was exposing has manifested in the news media. And as Ali mentioned, that creates a wholly different dynamic. The clients that are responding to that actually come to us after having, maybe worked through some sort of crisis process internally. And then so we often would get and we're still working through, especially the Microsoft Exchange and Halcyon responses, get calls that say, hey, can you help us, one, assure that the responses that we've already, put in play are adequate, and two, give us some assurance that, there's no threat actor persistence. And we, to your question about tools and sophistication, what those, the Hafnium, the SolarWinds, the Celion issues, what those have done is really turned up the wick on cyber threat intelligence and the processes in and around understanding, one, whether there is risk in a particular environment, whether the actors have the capability to target a particular client, whether that client is in some cases even a logical, in the case of SolarWinds, a second stage risk as an example. Are they government or are they municipal, education entity? There's different issues there from a risk perspective, and sometimes cyber threat intelligence will help that. And also, as we work through the initial request to, as an example, to take a look at their company's responses, we may work to better understand the environment through user behavior analytics. Is there an ongoing issue, and is that issue manifesting in some sort of Active Directory, account, misuse, or in some cases unauthorized access and lateral movement through accounts? We also are especially in those cases, are very quick to deploy, if not already deployed, endpoint monitoring in some form or fashion that will help us understand if there is issues at endpoints and the like. And so, as far as the current environment in and around some of these clients, moving to the cloud, Office 365 and the like, has really brought on an interesting issue in and around pursuing threats through software as a service. So if a threat has compromised Office 365 accounts and then has somehow bypassed multi-factor authentication, the understanding those disparate locations of artifacts and doing that in an automated way is something that the technology vendors have begun to respond to. So yes, these third-party issues are one, driving a technological response, but also driving a discussion, at different levels, whether it's at the boardroom or elsewhere, about third-party risks that we probably weren't talking about last year.
Yeah, it's a real shift. And Luke, have you seen that? Have you seen a focus by regulators for your clients in this issue post SolarWinds and post Celion and Microsoft Exchange?
Tremendous focus, Liz, and a lot of sophistication. I remember back in my DOJ days going in with our contingent for testimony in front of Congress on the Target breach. And I won't name names, but we were asked a question of why we thought this was a sophisticated breach if someone crawled through the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning ductwork to attack Target. And we tried to explain that that's not the sort of HVAC, access issue that occurred. We've come a long way, and the regulators now are extremely sophisticated. They have very skilled people, former agents, former prosecutors, technologists. And so you really need to bring your A game to the discussion. I kind of think of it as three parts. One is, planning, and the other is sort of prevention, mitigation, and then there's a strategy around the response that I think is evolving. But in the planning phase, you think about, for example, regulators are focused on what vendor of yours is a single point of failure for you, not just a data risk, but in a ransomware attack, if this processor goes down and you lose this line of business ability to operate, from a BCP planning standpoint, have you really thought around the corners for those types of things? So when you're gaming these things out, and we do tabletops, frequently the vendor failure risks are a big one, as well as data issues. On the contractual pieces, some places you're going to have a lot of leverage with a mom and pop vendor. Of course, you'll get your terms, but they may not actually mean anything at the end of the day if they can't fulfill it, versus AWS or someone who you may not have any leverage to get them to change any terms, but they're generally going to be good at what they do agree to. On prevention and mitigation, we're seeing the kind of threat intelligence that Daron was speaking of be used expertly by some clients, using some innovations like a vendor like Security Scorecard that uses threat intelligence to look at a vendor. You've got 1,000 vendors, you can only put your diligence effort around so many of them. Can we take an outside scan? And in my experience, if they look good on the outside, it may be that they're not good on the inside, but when they look bad on the outside, just about every case, they're also bad on the inside. So it can really help you sort of risk triage things. And then in the response strategy, the last thing I'll say, I find myself on the phone a lot of time for a major vendor or hoster of data of a big company, another company. And it's increasingly less about the fact that you had a breach as a vendor. It's more how you handled them and how you treated them. And did you bring them in? Did you share things with them? Were you proactive and transparent? And we've actually gotten clients receive a lot of praise and almost build more goodwill than they had before. I mean, you never wish it. You don't want to go through an incident, but they can show who they really are in those circumstances if they handle it right.
That's such an interesting point. And there has been a tremendous evolution over the last several years in sophistication, an increase in sophistication, I think, in the dialogue and the expectations. It's more subtle. And in some ways, sort of a bit more focused in terms of how do you handle these crises. So, Allie, we got a question for you, I think, coming from the audience about the contract. If you're a large company insisting on standardized terms, are you confident the vendors signing them can actually comply? If a vendor pushes back, are they potentially being more realistic about what they can actually do?
Yeah, I mean, we would hope that if they're signing to the terms or we're signing the terms that we'll actually comply with them. But I think some of that goes with the relationship and making sure that you are able to connect with them as to what their capabilities are and continuing to keep in touch with them through the life of that relationship.
Got it. So an ongoing dialogue is important. It's not just here's the contract, take it, and then we're done, and you've got the.
It's give and take, and I think with some of our larger clients and vendors who we have relationships with, we will game plan what happens in an emergency situation. If there is an incident with one of our co-branded cards, for example, we don't just say this is the relationship, great, everything's going to go forward in a satisfactory way. We try to game plan what could go wrong and work with them to understand who's taking on what role and how we would work together in that type of incident.
No, that's really interesting. So the third party becomes part of your incident response plan.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't happen for everybody, but for the much larger ones, there can be that discussion. And you can also, we've had clients who have put together playbooks on what they expect in some type of breach event. And that is obviously very useful because you can be proactive in planning for doomsday.
Yeah. And that really leads us to the next point we were going to touch on, which is the incident response plan. And the focus of regulators on it and the importance of it in running your businesses and your clients running their businesses. And regulators are very focused on it, right? So there was a really interesting case recently by the DFS against RMS and basically accusing the company of not reporting an incident properly, not having a proper incident response plan in place, and they were punished for that. So I think it's a signal that the regulators are actually going to bring cases on this issue. The SEC has not brought a case like that, so it was a pretty aggressive case to bring. So Allie, I'm curious, do you view this as sort of a critical part of your cybersecurity program, the whole incident response planning? How much of your time is sort of spent thinking about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think years ago there was so much focus on the technology and disaster recovery component, but now we're pivoting, especially for the legal and compliance folks who are on this call. It's really the training and preparation and the communication that go with it, because any weakness that you have is going to come out if you don't have all of those pieces put into place. So, we've got the benefit of learning from other companies who have been through this before, and they've illustrated the need to prepare and plan for this. It's shown us that having, fully thought through communication strategies and how you would respond really is crucial for successful recovery. I've said to people before, sometimes it's not the crime, it's the cover up. And if you have mangled communications and you're not putting out the right story to your regulators, to the media, to your clients, that makes you the poster child for what not to do. So I think we can all benefit from studying those past events and figuring out what worked and what didn't, and then make sure you plan in a way that puts you in a good path going forward.
Well, it's so true. I mean, that's where the regulators have caught people, right? The disclosure, the failure to disclose things that were known that the regulators viewed as material. So how critical is it for you to have your senior management and your board engaged on your cybersecurity program and on your incident response plan?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. I mean, with every company, the tone is always set from the top. So if they take it seriously, if your senior management does, if your board does, then everybody else in the company will as well. And with a large scale breach, you need senior engagement. You're going to need those people to talk to clients and regulators and everything that goes along with incident response. So you want to make sure that they're well versed in what their roles are, and that they're ready to play a role in it, because when the big one comes, you're going to need everybody on deck.
Mm-hmm. And what have you found to be the most effective way to engage senior management and the board?
I think for us, we've been very active in conducting exercises and tabletops with them. And I think so much of it goes along to muscle memory. The more that you put people in a scenario like that, where they've got to think as if they would in a real event, they get to play out, we all get to play out, the whole company does, what worked, what didn't work, what are our gaps, what do we need to improve on? And we've really learned a lot from doing that, because we've seen, just an example that comes to mind, we might have plans for our CEO to do 3 things. And by doing the tabletop, you realize she can't be in 3 places at one time. So you've got to come up with a delegation plan, or maybe you divide whatever it is she was supposed to do to other senior officers so that they can take some of it. So, it helps you find what's missing also, and then you can add that in.
That's so interesting. The engagement, the interaction, and then sort of the assessment of it is helpful. I mean, Luke, what's your view on the regulatory expectation of board involvement and senior management involvement on incident response planning?
Yeah, I think it's the ship sailed on that a few years ago. The SEC and others have sort of laid down the gauntlet. NYDFS. There's no escaping senior management and board involvement. And really, if you've been through one of these rodeos, a big one, you wouldn't want it any other way if you're the board and senior management. There's no worse feeling than not knowing your role, or not knowing if your people really have a plan, have it under control. So the type of exercises Ollie is talking about, I think, are perfect, because people's eyes are open, and it's not always the issues they thought would take center stage. A lot of people that haven't been through this think of this mainly as a technology kind of battle with the attackers and so forth. And that's true, it's part of it. But the most dominant issue, in my experience, are the communications issues. That's what really occupies the senior management level, is how do we stage and sequence communications across all these groups. We're about to do an earnings call. We have this big thing brewing in the network people don't know about. Do we close a trading window? Do we change the talking points for the call? Do we come out and say something to our bank regulators ahead of the board? How do we balance commercial and retail? And then there's the media. They've gotten very savvy, Liz, at all of this. They're a number of them follow along on dark web results, so they may know, just like people policing their vendors, they may know about somebody's issue before they do. And some of the attack groups realize this and they leverage the media. So having a communications plan and strategy and having that function tightly integrated in the core response team is really crucial.
Have you found that clients are doing that, or is that something where you're sort of saying you got to do it? I mean, has it? Do you think it's progressed in terms of the industry getting more there? I mean, I've experienced both, but curious to hear what your experience is.
Yeah, it's a wide range. I would say that in the U.S., where we're very litigious and we have had a lot of regulatory pressure on cyber issues, it's maybe a little more advanced than I've seen it in other parts of the world. For example, with Europe, I think they've been ahead of us for some years on privacy issues, and the U.S. has spent several years learning hard lessons based on GDPR and other people about privacy issues and data subject rights and so forth. I also think they're behind, frankly, if I may humbly say so, on the cybersecurity aspects of this. And the communications issues are a combination of these things. But just running an exercise and figuring out whether what the people running that work stream prepared to release as the holding statement or the talking points is on the same page with what the CEO and her team would want from this, or the board, is really eye-opening. We've seen sort of the biggest disconnects in that space.
And Luke, if I can just add one thing to that too, I think what we've also learned is that the business implications often come into play. Again, the technology is kind of taken care of by the CISO organization, but making sure you have your business teams understanding what might happen. Say your payment transfer system goes out, which client transactions take priority, who do you need to notify? There's so many other pieces that come in that aren't necessarily technology related, but that the company overall, especially a financial institution, needs to worry about.
So Daron, in what ways do you advise financial companies to sort of tailor their incident response plan to prepare for regulatory, review and inquiry?
Well, aside from violently agreeing with Ellie and Luke, and maybe absorbing some of the thoughts that we've discussed, that Luke is entirely correct in the sense that a year or 5 years ago, when we talked about incident response plans, it was network diagrams, it was understanding the technological space, and now we are definitely. Well, we learned really from the SolarWinds issue and how FireEye handled it actually, and in numerous ways that response was lauded and applauded in various places. And so companies, especially those in the financial vertical, really have to have a plan, and they have to exercise that plan, as Ellie and really Luke have said. But the key pieces of those plans that when we do responses sometimes that we see tend to need help is the discovery, reporting, and elevation of that internally. And I think Ellie mentioned it before, the roles around who should be talking about what is really important, and getting that message clear, concise, especially when you have regulator interest, or because it's in the news cycle that there will be regulator interest. Those processes really have to flow quickly, and they also inform whether there's outside counsel that's going to be brought in and a forensics firm. If that discovery and data elevation is healthy, as these support mechanisms are enabled, they can really, ramp up and get engaged in a productive way really quickly. One additional way I think that companies in the financial vertical can really help themselves is, don't wait for a breach to talk to your insurance company. Don't wait for a breach to really have a good relationship with potential outside counsel, and maybe even, forensic vendors, potentially know and have a discussion with a couple of vendors about your incident response plan, and maybe even work through that process long before, you have a breach. And then, one thing that can be also helpful is to mitigate harm after the breach is discovered. And there's numerous ways to really approach that from a proactive perspective, and a challenge that we often run into as a result of whether it's a third party issue or an on-premise or internal issue is available artifacts to understand what actually happened. And so acquiring that visibility at the system level, at the host level, or through Active Directory, maybe user behavior analytics, and really getting a clear understanding of, is there a problem now? Is this a historical issue? Or is there, are we looking at a containment? The quicker you get to that sort of matrix and decision process, hopefully the less exposure or harm that might occur. And the quicker you get to that, the more you can address regulatory questions, whether it's SEC or New York regimes or the like. The available artifacts and the things like subscription services to your cloud provider, AWS or Office 365. There's various levels that in some cases you can purchase, and there's certain levels that don't offer a whole lot of granularity or visibility into activity over time, and you really got to game plan that through your cybersecurity program. But it's also part of your incident response plan. If we have an issue, are we going to be able to benefit from logs over time? How long are our logs stored? Do they need to be stored longer? And those kinds of sort of I'd say proactive measures or forward-thinking measures are something that can really help, not just in financial, verticals, but others. But I think when you have regulators that are interested in how you did business, how you reported your risk, how you talked to your board, and then what your response was and whether that was effective, you really got to take all that into account when you're looking at your incident response plan.
That's great. Thanks, Daron. So, Allie, I think we have another quick question for you. We could ask it more generally, but do you all ever bring in your operational risk management to help when you're assessing?
Yes, absolutely. Operational risk is kind of the hot topic of the day in financial firms. So the team that deals with that and our overall risk department are much more active in the cyberspace than they ever were years ago. And that's because the regulators are frankly demanding it, and there's certainly a benefit to their being involved as well. So I would say a successful cyber program, certainly within a financial institution, it's no longer just the CISO team. You now have compliance engagement, you have legal, you have risk, you have audit, the 3 lines of defense program where you've got the business as first line, compliance and risk as the second, and audit as the third. They all have to work in tandem to make sure you've really got the right framework in place for a program.
Okay, great. Well, we could talk about incident response all day. I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about some of the cases that we kind of see coming down the pike, potentially from the SEC and the DOJ. They have announced previously, and they've done some activity previously about failure to disclose either incidents or, information about cybersecurity issues. Curious, Luke, whether you think this is going to be a trend, whether they're going to look at disclosure cases, they're going to look at trading cases before the cyber events, and obviously disclosure post-event.
Yeah, it's a great question, Liz. They've spent a couple of years laying the groundwork on this, issuing the warnings, issuing priorities as SEC does. And we are seeing it play out now in terms of a much more forward approach to following up on incidents and asking very hard questions. and they're focused on a number of things. It's across the spectrum, but one is, are senior management and the board having the right issues raised up to them? In other words, are there healthy reporting lines where issues are flowing up? And this was reflected a couple of years ago in the SEC's guidance, as you know, and that is a real thing now. They're focused on whether the CISO, information security, whether they have a direct path. I don't know that there's a magic reporting line, but it has to be substantive and real. Then when it gets to the level of the board, the risk committee and so forth, is there sufficient airtime and attention being given to the issues? And then follow through. Is it just an academic exercise where we brief the board once or twice a year on cybersecurity risks and issues? Or does the board have effectively a dashboard where they're following the progress in these areas, asking hard questions? Are we learning lessons from things or near brushes that we've had, or other people's incidents in our sector that we could study and learn from? On the insider trading side, lastly, much more aggressive. And of course, we saw the first prosecution in this space related to the Equifax breach. And I think there are going to be more where they really look hard at what people knew in advance of trades, risk disclosures and so forth, and your risk factors. As you see, it can no longer be an academic exercise. You have to point to real things that happen. You have to make it concrete. So we're seeing SEC in tandem with DOJ much more sort of forward deployed, if you will, on these issues.
Yeah, and we've seen some. Oh, I'm sorry, Liz. I was going to jump in just to kind of dovetail off that. We've seen, SEC or justice notification to clients as a result of trading irregularities, as an example, and that trend seems to be on the uptick. And so when you have regular interest at the beginning, you really got a different challenge, or at least a challenge that needs attention, maybe in a different way than other verticals.
I mean, Allie, as in-house, how much are you going to deal with, saying, do we have proper procedures around trading and, issues like that? How involved do you get in that? And what's your thought on?
Yeah, we get really involved because it's another area where you can plan in advance. So to prevent insider trading, you can ask, do you have the right trading hold policy in place? Do you know who's going to communicate it? When is it going to get activated? Who's subject to it? Because those are things you don't necessarily want to decide on the fly in the moment of battle. So wherever you can plan in advance, there is a benefit to doing so. We also see that planning as a really important part of regulatory notification, because we do have so many different groups that we need to notify. And it gets increasingly more difficult as you've got a global presence. And to complicate it even more, what used to be a fairly standard process of required notifications, now we have what are called courtesy notifications, where an event might not have actually triggered some type of formal notification, but just out of best practice or a courtesy to our regulators, we think we should let them know. And then to make that even more complicated, you might want to just let your primary regulators know, but they all talk now. So even if you tell a US regulator, we might get a call from somebody in the UK saying, we heard this, the supervisory college, they share information. So then you also have the issue of, in a way, front-running regulators, where you don't want to tell one regulator something too far in advance of then notifying another, because they also talk about, well, when did we get notified and what did you know? And that also gets more complicated by the facts change. They always change. So when you start to tell one story and then you update another regulator, do you then go back and notify everybody else? It's kind of like a domino effect, where once you start the process, you have to really think about who you're going to notify and what you're going to say and how you go about providing those updates, so that everybody has a full slate of information to work from.
And there really is comparison among regulators as to whether they're notified. Yeah, there's comparison, but not so much coordination, right?
Well, we're seeing coordination more and more. I mean, certainly there are joint regulatory exams these days. I mean, I think a number of firms on the street right now are going through a horizontal cybersecurity review of which you've got 3 different agencies working together and they're each coming in. And, you know, that is a benefit to the financial institution. So we're not doing 3 individually, but it does also mean a much bigger exam. So I think you're seeing more and more coordination. And so there's benefit on the financial institution side to planning how you're going to work with each or them collectively to make sure you're coordinated and you've got a consistent story through any breach.
Yeah. And I think for sure we're going to see increased joint enforcement actions. And, you know, while it's helpful to have the regulators in there and do joint exams, it can also lead to joint enforcement actions later on. So, you know, lots of risk for companies on this, on the cybersecurity side. Bruce, we have a minute or two?
Got like 30 seconds.
Oh, 30 seconds. Any final thoughts? Let's do that. Go ahead. Take it away. Luke?
Yeah, just to say that despite all what seems like bad news, we are seeing lessons and patterns of good results emerge. So you can definitely extract some really, you know, good practices from everything that we're all talking about and experiencing. And it is actually reducing risk for people. So there's a silver lining to all of this.
Yeah, and I'll just add for my final thought, I think from an in-house perspective, just make sure you come up with a governance structure and a plan for your cyber program, because more and more regulators are wanting to see a fulsome program, which really addresses on communication to the board, senior management, metrics. Do you have the right engagement from second and third line? So it's really putting all those pieces together to make sure you can address each of them individually.
My last parting shot would be communicate with your insurance companies, your vendors, your incident response team, your counsel. It's this is evolving as we speak, and that constant communication is only going to help survive a big event.
Terrific.
Thank you, Liz. And to Ali, Daron, and Luke, terrific job. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have our last spotlight of the day coming up in 5 minutes. It's a discussion with the head enforcement lawyer at OFAC. So come back at 4:50 and we will see you in a minute. Thank you.